Turn tonight to Matthew chapter 5 for our continuation of our studies about after. After you put your hand to the plow, he said, of course, not to look back. Then we had a second study. After you visit the upper room, not to just stand there and gaze, but to go on to the deeper life, head toward the goal. And so the message tonight is building upon that. That after you've put your hand to the plow, after you have visited the upper room, then the question is, how are you building upon that? What are you building your life upon? Now that you're saved and baptized in Spirit, which the plow and the upper room signify, how are you building your life? Upon stone or upon sand? So that's the question. Are you building, now that you've had those two experiences, are you building upon stone or upon sand? Now at the close of the Sermon on the Mount, and that's what Matthew 5, 6, and 7 is about, and that's what we'll be dealing with tonight, Jesus contrasted those who heed and obey his teachings with those who disobey. And he shows us that those who obey, take seriously and obey what he says here in these 3 chapters, as well as the whole New Testament, or Bible, their lives are characterized as being built upon stone or a rock. And of course those who disobey, he closes by saying that they're building upon sand and they're foolish. Now the main factor that's going to determine whether or not your life will endure, now that you've put your hand to the plow and visited the upper room, the major factor that will determine whether or not you will endure the tests and trials of life, as well as the judgment that is soon to come, is your attitude and reaction to his teachings in Matthew 5, 6, and 7. And we're limiting our study to that tonight because we can't teach the whole New Testament. Whatever we say will apply. The Sermon on the Mount is a good summary of what you need to know to do if you're going to enter the kingdom, because he says in the sermon, it's not just believing in me or saying you do, but you have to do what I say. Matthew 7, 21, 22. But generally, the importance of that is overlooked in this age of believism and churchianity, of religious compromise. And you hear professing Christians say things like, well, I know I'm standing on the rock, I believe in Jesus. To which he replies, if you don't obey my words, you're not standing on a rock. You're the foolish man standing or building upon sand. And so if you try to excuse any disobedience to the sermon, where we limit our study tonight, but as I say, it applies to any of his teachings in the Word. But if you try to excuse any disobedience to the sermon by saying, as so many do, well, that's not for today. That was for the Jews of the first century, or it's for the Jews, the laws of the kingdom out there in the millennium, or he was only speaking to the 12 apostles, or the teachings of the sermon are not to be adhered to in letter because they're impossible to comply with in this complex society in which we live today. So just lift out the principles and apply them occasionally the best you can. Or others will say, well, I'm not saved by works but by faith. And if I have to do anything, including obey the Sermon on the Mount, then that's works and not faith. Well, we only bother to answer such statements. In fact, they've already been answered over the years. But if that is your attitude, then you're the foolish man or woman building your house upon sand, and it will only require sufficient trials and tests to reveal that it's sand and not stone, as it has in many cases, and not a few over the years at Faith Assembly. It's still being revealed to some in Faith Assembly that they're building on sand because, well, where are they? They were here. They were here last week or last month or last year. Now, a detailed study of the Sermon on the Mount is given in our Christian ethics tapes, and so we refer you to those of you who have not studied the Sermon on the Mount in detail. And in the Deeper Life book, the whole 4th chapter gives in great detail a study of every verse of Matthew 5, 6, and 7, which is the teaching of Jesus concerning Christian conduct, how a Christian should live under grace. You will find in that study, whether tapes or literature, both that he deals basically with 3 areas, and that is teachings concerning self and teachings concerning our conduct toward others, and then our relationship to God, like when you pray and so on. Tonight I want to deal with 3 concepts as they relate to those 3 areas of application: self, others, and God. Because we can't teach the whole sermon in one night, and it's already taught anyway. I'm going to deal with some things tonight I've never dealt with. So I'm going to deal with 3 concepts, and that is purity, peace, and possessions. Helps you to remember it, because they all start with P, but then they do because that's the way he gave it. And rather than take all the teachings that relate to self and others and God, and we'd be here till next week, we're just taking those 3 concepts, but I'm sure if we examine those, you'll get a pretty good indication of whether or not you're building your life on stone or sand. Purity with reference to self, for example. Jesus taught that we were to be pure of heart. He teaches here that we should avoid lust with the eyes and the mind, and fornication and adultery. So that refers to ourselves. We should be pure of heart if we want to see God. And then in relation to others, he speaks here about the necessity of peacemaking and nonresistance and turning the other cheek and going the second mile. And then with reference to God, he speaks about getting our priorities in the right order and seeking first the kingdom of God and his righteousness, and letting material possessions be taken care of by God himself. So this speaks of your character, purity of heart, your conduct, how you relate to others, whether it's your peace with them. I think we can show you that there's some areas where peacemaking and peacekeeping are a little more difficult than others. And then in our relation to God, it speaks of consecration, that we are to put him first and not, the byproducts of the kingdom first, as most do. And so with that background and introduction, remember the series deals with what are you doing after you put your hand to the plow, which speaks of salvation. What are you doing after you visit the upper room? Now we get down to what you should be doing after, how you should be building upon it. And these 3 ideas of purity, peace, and possessions will indicate to you how you're building. And probably these are the best 3 ideas that we could pick out of the sermon: purity with self, peace toward others, and possessions with respect to putting God first or self first, of all the ideas here. So first of all, we'll start with the idea of purity in relation to self. Notice Matthew 5:8. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. And then, of course, the teaching on purity continues in verses 27 and following. You heard in old time, thou shalt not commit adultery, but I say unto you, whosoever looks on a woman, and it works the other way, looks on a woman to lust after her, has committed adultery with her already in his heart. And then he speaks of if your right eye or right arm offends you, then cut it off. It's better to lose a member of the body than to be cast into hell. Verse 31, it has been said, whosoever should put away his wife, let him give her a writing of divorcement. But I say unto you that whosoever should put away his wife, except for the cause of fornication, causes her to commit adultery. As Luke says, if she remarries, causes her to commit adultery. And whosoever shall marry her that's divorced commits adultery. So here he speaks of our personal purity. Of all the things that would be important in our lives that we could deal with, it'd be personal purity, because the necessity for personal purity is no small matter, because twice in the New Testament and once in the Old, and I didn't look in a concordance, it may be more, at least 3 times in the Bible, having a pure heart is the condition for being saved, or seeing God, or being in his presence. We see it already here in Matthew 5:8, and then over in Hebrews 12, verse 14, we read that we are to follow after peace with all men and holiness, or purity, without which no man shall see God. Matthew 5:8, you have to be pure of heart to see God. You have to be holy to see God. And then in Psalm 24:3 and 4, seeing God is equated with being in his holy presence. Psalm 24:3 and 4, who shall ascend into the hill of the Lord? Who shall stand in his holy place? Have you learned that one? We learned that as children. He that hath clean hands, clean life, and a pure heart. You want to stand in God's presence, purity. Oh, you can kid yourself or deceive yourself about being a Christian. Tell yourself you are, and that you speak in tongues. That proves you have the baptism of the Holy Spirit. But we better take him seriously. We've got to be holy, pure people. Now, this requirement for purity and holiness as a condition of salvation, or the condition of salvation, is not just limited to one age group like the older ones of us, but all age groups, because Paul in 2 Timothy 2:22 speaks to the youth. He says to you who are younger than the rest of us, flee youthful lusts. Flee youthful lusts. Don't even stay around them. Run the other way and follow righteousness, faith, love, and peace with them that call on God out of a pure heart. There's the pure heart again. 2 Timothy 2:22. You're expected as youth to be pure of heart. Now the admonition is especially needed in this end time age generation of the new morality, so-called, that Satan has introduced, which really isn't new. A new morality is just morality that's practiced by more people, more often, more openly, and so they think something new is happening. No, it's just more of it, and you see it more. But it results from the hippie influence, largely, which was Satan's tool back during 50s and 60s, and now we see the result of it with their stress. And you'll see why we keep mentioning hippies influencing the whole younger generation is because of their stress upon freedom of expression. Freedom to say what you want, freedom to do what you want, freedom to be what you want. They don't want anyone to restrain them. You ought to read Psalm 2. They throw off all restraints of God and man and government. The freedom to say what you want has resulted in a 4-letter word vocabulary that you hear and read everywhere today. You'd have to go in almost the pit of hell to hear what you hear today right over the radio or read in the literature that they give the kids to read in school, so they'll, really have a realistic approach to life. So to say what they want means to slander the government and authorities and to protest and all of that. Using the tongue. Freedom to do what one wants means exactly that. Free to do what one wants, from sex to drugs, from rioting to crime. When they want, where they want, and that's why when Billy Graham went to London, he was surprised, and this is during the hippie influence, major influence when it was getting started, found couples right out in public having sex in the park. And he was kind of shocked, but friends, I could tell you some things I've seen, and you just have to get away from there. There's no point in going into it and painting pictures of lewdness, but just recently when I was in Chicago, and I'm not going to give the details and contradict myself, but a girl, a young woman, must have been about 20, 21, was literally taking all she could from a man right out in public. And it was right in front of the building where I was going in and out. They didn't care, standing between two cars in the gutter, and that's indicative of what they were doing. Now, everything but the actual act, and I don't know whether they got around to that or not because I left. I'm saying they don't care anymore. To do what you want. The hippie influence, to be what you want, means to travel around from city to city and state to state for years trying to find yourself or to find your identity, living out of the garbage cans or maybe working a week or two as a dishwasher till you can get enough money to buy some more drugs and travel on to the next town. Freedom to be what you want, which is nothing. And so the new morality, as I've said, is not new. It's just more people, more often, more openly doing the same old things. It's new in that sense. Take, for example, where 25 years ago, you rarely ever heard of a girl having a baby out of wedlock. Offhand, I can't remember any that was true of, but you would hear occasionally a rumor. Now, hundreds of thousands of teenage girls every year. And I don't remember anyone that I could identify that had to have an abortion. And now over 300,000 teenage girls have abortions every year. And that's not counting all of the married women that don't want their babies and kill them. So we just see more of the same old thing. It was happening back then, but I'm telling you, we're living in the end time generation where the young people are going to have to be on special guard to guard their purity, because all of this that we're mentioning is something that they just take as their inalienable right to do what they want, when they want and where they want. I only heard of one person who caught VD. One person in all of my youth. And he did because he visited prostitutes. But now VD is in epidemic proportions, and mostly among the youth. 1,500 cases of VD, syphilis and the other, every month? No. Every week? No. Every day. 1,500 new cases. And so there are just hundreds of thousands of youth that are eaten up with sexual disease. Back during the good old days, back when, you might soap a window or something at Halloween when you went that route in those days. High school students might take a bench off of the school front yard and hoist it up on the flagpole, tie it up there so the administration would see it the next day. But that was the limit of it. But now millions and millions of dollars of damage, where many times you go in and destroy a whole school overnight. Break the windows, destroy the furniture, set fires, throw ink and paint all over the rooms. Millions of dollars worth of damage, and assault the teachers, and rape and kill. And they have to have policemen standing in the halls in the high schools. Well, we won't get into whose fault that is. That's another story. But I never heard of a young person. I don't know of a single young person that ever got arrested for anything, not even speeding. And yet today, 40% of all the males who are arrested are under 21. Of all the automobiles stolen, and that's 2 a minute, which is over 1 million a year, 2 automobiles a minute being stolen, 50% of them are stolen by youth, 18 and under. And I never heard of anybody I knew or heard of, and you meet hundreds of people by the time you're 20 or 21 that ever got arrested for anything. It was rare to hear of 2 students in college caught, in, what we would have said then an embarrassing situation, which is spelled sex, but now it's just running rampant. It's openly done, indulged in, and it's not frowned upon, but that's their right. We're not to tell them what to do, whether they're lesbian or homosexual or just, fornicators. And the school authorities allow visitations back and forth in the dormitories and that sort of thing. I read recently about a father who went to visit his daughter on the college campus in the dormitory and got up to her room, and someone told him that she was out, and so he saw the door ajar, so he thought he'd go in and look around or wait, and said when he opened the door, there was her roommate in the nude having sex with one of her boyfriends, and not only was the door not locked, it wasn't even closed. They couldn't care less. That's just the norm. It's like, what you eat, where you go to school or whatever, it's just a topic to discuss. The sad part is, the book went on to say that after he got over the initial shock, he accepted this as the way of the new generation, the new morality. This is the way the kids live today, rather than taking it more seriously. But as over in Genesis 3, where we read that the apple, as in the case of Eve, the apple that Eve ate, she discovered had a worm in it. So it is today with all of these who are ignoring God's laws about purity and what you do with your body with respect to drugs or keeping it pure in the ways we've mentioned, and so on. They find the apple has a worm in it because, just take the matter of sexual license. Women who thought, they could avoid the responsibility of having more children by using the pill, and unwed girls who thought the same, they could avoid the embarrassment, although it's not embarrassment today, but avoid the trouble of having a baby out of wedlock by taking the pill, and both young and old who thought, if I, practice sex with anybody I want and catch VD, which is in epidemic proportions today, they've got all these miracle drugs that will cure it. But now they're finding the apple has a worm in it. The pill is causing cancer. The pill is not preventing illegitimate births in the teenage girls. For whatever reason, it isn't. Generally, they don't know how to take it, I suppose. And VD, as I say, 1,500 new cases a day. So the apple has a worm in it. With respect to drugs, the whole younger generation, almost without exception, is experimenting with that. But young and old, you see, are seeking a chemical escape from reality. They think they can do that on drugs. They think by taking drugs they can find God or have a religious experience, but again, they're finding that the casualty rate is rather high, with deaths and suicides and murder of your friends or your family while you're on drugs, and divorces and minds that are destroyed, and on and on. Are people just plain becoming junkies and have to turn to crime to keep up their habit? But the culture of our day, and parents should not be surprised why the children, that is, the young people, are on drugs, because they're being reared in a pill culture. They see mother take a diet pill to avoid breakfast, and see daddy take a pep pill so he can face the day down at the office. Then mother and dad both take either an aspirin or a tranquilizer to see them through to 5 o'clock. Then they have to have a drink or a cocktail when they get home to make it through to supper time. And then they take sleeping pills so they can rest at night. And then in between all of that, they ingest handfuls of drugs of all kinds. I heard one the other day was on 21 or 22 kinds of drugs. They take drugs of all kinds for every little symptom or problem or trial that arises. So parents should not be surprised why the children have gone to pot. And then another area that explains why we have this low morality among the youth today, and of course the whole culture for that matter, but we're addressing ourselves to the youth basically, is because of permissive parents. Permissive parents like the permissive teachers, the liberal secular education teachers like the psychiatrists and the psychologists. Permissive parents like these say we should not censor everything our children read or watch. That we should not try to shelter them from sin. We should allow them to express themselves. Because after all, they're going to have to get out there in that world, that real world, and they're going to be confronted with sin and vice and viciousness and violence and drugs and sex and all of this. And so children need to see life as it really is. Now, if you've ever read a book on psychology, you recognize that as almost a direct quote. Though it wasn't, but I've read so much and heard so much that that's the way they think. That youth need to face life and see life as it is. That's the argument in the schools and by permissive parents and by the psychiatrists and psychologists. But that isn't a valid argument. I mean, one doesn't have to drink poison to know that it will kill him. All he has to do is believe the warning on the label on the bottle. You see, I don't have to test these things to find out if they really will kill or work. And so our children do not, I don't follow that argument, never did, have to read all of that trashy literature with the 4-letter words and the violence and the sex in it in school just for them to learn how some perverted author thinks, which is what it is. No, all he has to do is just go to school or to go out in the neighborhood. He'll get that from the street, from the school, and from his neighbors. I mean, I don't have to buy the porno literature to find out all the new perversions that are current today. All I have to do is read Romans chapter 1. And I'll find out about perversion, all I need to know about perversion. I'll also find out when I read Romans 1 what God does to those who indulge in it. So the question is, how are you measuring up? Now that you've put your hand to the plow, visited the upper room, how are you measuring up? Since you find yourself birthed into this degenerate generation with its new old morality, are you a victim or the victor as a young person? Are you fleeing youthful lusts and doing as Paul says here in 2 Timothy 2:22, following after those who follow righteousness and faith and peace and love out of a pure heart? Now, it could be that while you're not exactly following after youthful lusts, it may be that you're not really fleeing from them either. You know, it's one thing not to actually indulge in something overtly or outwardly. It's another thing, while you're not following it, you're not exactly fleeing from it. That is to say, you've never tried pot or been on drugs, but do you wonder just what it might feel like to expand your mind and just take a trip off somewhere and have a religious experience? You see, that's how the devil gets those who are not following sin, but because they're not fleeing from it either, he gets them enticed. You may not be engaged in fornication, but are you engaging in fornication in your mind? You see, we just read here that Jesus said that makes you guilty, just as if you committed the act. Because the heart is the source of sin. It isn't just the outward action. Well, all of that's in the Deeper Life book and on the tapes to show you what Jesus thinks about people who lust in their heart. They can't justify they didn't commit the act. Are you feasting your eyes on all the filth and trash that comes through? Trashy vision. And that way you can sin vicariously. You can enter into the enjoyment of sin vicariously. Well, I didn't actually do anything, but you sit there and gobble it all up like you're eating Wheaties or something. Some people are not exactly following after youthful lust, but they're not fleeing from them, as we said. They may be toying with temptation, saying, well, I can neck a little. I don't know what they call it now. We called it necking back in the good old days. I can neck a little with my boyfriend or girlfriend. I won't let it go too far. Well, that's what a lot of those unwed mothers we mentioned said. And those unwed mothers and the fathers of those babies who contracted this 1,500 cases a day VD, that's what they thought. And then the rest of us, we've been talking about the youth. What is your status to date concerning purity of heart? Are you measuring up or giving in? Are you following the youth or are they following your example? I mean, this is addressed to all of us in Hebrews 12:14. It's addressed to all of us in Matthew 5:8. And in Psalm 24, who shall ascend into the holy hill of God, into his presence? He that has clean hands and a pure heart. There's no generation gap concerning sin. It infects and affects the human race, young and old alike. So are you an example to those we've been addressing, the youth? If they could follow you around for a week or a month, are you an example to them, or are you following their example? I'm talking about those who are not fleeing the youthful lust. God help you if you're like that father I read about who was counseling his boys. And this is almost a direct quote. I don't quote out of books that are copyrighted for obvious reasons, but he said to his boys in counseling them, there is no generation gap. I lust and you lust. I hate others and you hate. I worry about war and poverty and so do you. I get anxious and so do you get anxious. I lose my temper and get angry and so do you. Now this man who said that claims to be a Christian and following the Bible. Now I don't know what perversion of the Bible he's using. You know, we talk about versions of the Bible. That would have to be a perversion of the Bible he's using, but my Bible says that he that lusts and hates will not see God. Without holiness you'll not see God. And over in 1 John 2, he that hates his brother abides in death. So are you measuring up or giving in? Victim or victor? Young and old alike. Purity of heart is a requirement for seeing God. Now with that in mind, then let's move on to the second admonition of Jesus in the Beatitudes, verse 9. This is in relation to others. That was in relation to our own lives. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God. Now that's also the requirement in Hebrews 12:14. Did you remember that? Hebrews 12:14. Follow after peace and holiness with all, without which no man shall see God. You see, it isn't just holiness over there, but we have to follow peace. And there's a sense in which it is harder to maintain the peace than it is the holiness or the purity. I mean, you can separate yourself from sin and not get involved in drugs and illicit sex and crime and all of these other things. Some things you wouldn't do, so you just isolate yourself. But peacemaking? Well, that's another question. But blessed are the peacemakers, because they're going to be called the children of God. I want to deal with this aspect of the study tonight from 2 points. One with respect to the family and the home, keeping peace there, and then with the world in general. First of all, the home or the family or the marriage. Generally, you'll find that one of the hardest places to keep and make peace is in the home. Now, I didn't get any amens, but that's because I didn't expect any. It's just a fact. Some men who as diplomats are able to achieve peace between the most aggressive of nations have been married and divorced themselves 2 or 3 times. Do you get the point, or do I have to explain? In other words, they can bring nations together, but they can't bring their marriages together. Now that's a fact of life. Some ministers who are as patient as Job in dealing with some erring or recalcitrant church members who remain cool in a deacon's board meeting when he knows that some are out to get his scalp if they can, yet gets angry over something trivial at home, or relatively trivial. A wife who can smile right through almost an accident in traffic when somebody tried to run her off the road, or just keep smiling at the smart aleck remarks that a rude clerk gives her when she's so dumb to ask, is this still on sale today? Will lose her temper and smile if her son steps on her flowers or her husband fails to clean up his mess in the bathroom. I'm saying peacemaking, it's easier out there in the world. Sometimes because you've got the threat of the black eye maybe, but it's easier out there than to keep peace in the home. A husband who will say to his secretary who's an hour late for work, oh, don't think anything about that. That could happen to anybody. Threatens to cut off his wife's grocery money if she's late with supper. Where better would the admonition be needed, blessed are the peacemakers, than in the home? You see, the responsibility for making and keeping the peace, both keeping and making the peace. He said, blessed are the peacemakers, but peacekeepers, if you keep reading Matthew 5, he talks about keeping the peace, nonviolence, turning the other cheek. And so the responsibility for making and keeping the peace is the responsibility of both husband and wife, because the responsibility of breaking the peace is equally divided between husband and wife. Now, you may not know that, because if you listen only to the liberal media, the ERA and the Women's Lib, you get the impression that husbands are the chief offenders, they are the aggressors, and they are the ones that break the peace in the marriage. In fact, we even have terminology like battered wife crisis today. We have centers where beaten wives can get help and get counsel and get protection and medical treatment, because a lot of them are beaten. Black eyes, broken arms, and killed and whatever. But the story behind the story, which we need to hear and which you never, ever, any place ever hear, the story behind the story is that there are as many battered husbands as battered wives. Now, you've never heard that unless you heard me say it. I've hinted at it before. But you never hear that. And the reasons for that. I mean, it's 50%, friends. Those are the statistics. Those are the facts. You can do your own research and study just like I do if you don't want to take my word for it. Because all you see is the woman with the black eye, or the teeth knocked out, or bruised and battered. So the reasons why you never hear the other side, the story behind the story, let me give you some reasons. One is that men are generally, being men, ashamed to admit their wife beat them up. That's just the way you are. A wife doesn't hesitate to say, my husband did it. Call the police. Or whatever. But men are generally ashamed, and so they make excuses. I bumped into the door. That's why my eye's black. Or, that looks like fingernail scratches down your face. No, I was mowing the lawn, stumbled and tripped and fell into the rose bushes. And so on. Men will make excuses. That's why that it doesn't get on the reports, police blotters and so forth. Secondly, women, being the weaker sex, generally weaker and smaller, usually cannot inflict much visible damage. Not with her hands or fists, she just can't. There can be exceptions to anything. Forget the exceptions. Like a 300-pound woman and a 120-pound husband, she might be able to mop the floor with him. But unless she uses a gun or a knife or a baseball bat, it doesn't usually show on a man. But men being stronger, he only has to hit his wife once or twice with his fists and it'll show. I'm telling you why it doesn't make the reports in the media or anywhere else. And then another reason, the ERA and Women's Lib have absolutely no sympathy for a battered husband, so they won't even talk about it. And if you want to know who controls the media, I just told you. The men are the ones who are supporting ERA and Women's Lib. The reason it didn't pass because the women didn't support the ERA. You should know that. But statistical studies show, now listen to it, that the homicide rate where women kill their husbands is almost 50%. In other words, it's almost equal. Secondly, throwing things at a partner. I mean things that can hurt, like dishes and bricks and rocks. Shoving and pushing is also about equal, 50%. Hitting with the hands or hitting with a hard object like a baseball bat or a poker or whatever is the same, 50%. And in most cases, now listen to this, I didn't say half on this. In most cases, a good 90 to 95% of all charges of wife beating against a husband, in most cases, it comes right out in the case, history, trial, or whatever, that the wife provoked him to hit her by many ways, just doing things that just absolutely exasperated him, or generally it's through verbal abuse and cursing him. She brings it on herself. That doesn't excuse it. I'm just telling you the facts, the story behind the story. And besides verbal abuse, many of the cases, and this again is the majority of cases, the husband hit her back and it leaves damage. Of course, when he hits, generally, he hit her back only after he had been hit by her. Repeatedly. And that's the only way he knew to stop it, or he finally lost his temper. Now, that is no justification, men, for you saying, well, I'm glad to get to the story behind the story. I knew all along that it was probably mostly her fault. In those cases where they've gone to court, police and all of that, and these people are not sympathetic toward the men who are reporting this. I'm saying they report that in most cases she brought it on herself. And she will admit that. And sometimes they bring it on themselves to get a divorce because most states give the woman the benefit of the doubt, and so she'll antagonize her husband, so they'll hit her, give her a black eye or whatever, and then you run to the hospital, you got a medical report, and so that's sufficient in most states. And especially with women's lib and ERA, the women's movement encouraging women today to be aggressive and to be violent toward men, and that includes their husbands, then you can see why the story behind the story is that it's equal. 50% for all practical purposes, women beat up husbands as husbands beat up women. Now you need to know that because if you're going to help people, especially if you're in the ministry, you need to know those things because I've dealt with more than one case of battered husbands. Did you know that? Well, sure. And that's only the tip of the iceberg because most men won't admit that petite, little, slim, 90-pound Sunday school teacher type wife beat them up. Oh, not a man. He's not going to admit it. I'm not talking about the question of truth and the consequences if you don't tell it. As one sociologist said, the greatest unreported crime in America is husband beating by their wives because they won't report it. It's only, in drastic cases where their life is threatened sometimes they will report it. And to say those studies are available with all the case histories, and it just boggles your mind that this never gets out. All of my 62 years, I never heard it till I started to study in this area. And the facts I just gave you are out of a book that has like 20 chapters, and one is on husband beating. The other 19 are wives who have been beaten up. So they weren't in sympathy, I'm saying, with the husbands. They were just reporting the facts. And so, as the sociologist went on to say, we should no longer use the term wife beating because wives beat up husbands or beat on them as often as vice versa. And so what we need to term it to be accurate is person abuse because it's 50-50. We're talking about keeping peace in the home, friends. There's something wrong because there are just thousands upon thousands of cases where it's not just, a disagreement and they don't speak for 2 or 3 days until they make up. Beatings. And not the worst of it is physical all the time because there's such a thing as punishing your mate with your tongue. Verbal abuse. Insults. Slander. Not the worst of it is physical all the time because there's such a thing as punishing your mate with your tongue. Verbal abuse. Insults. Slander. Now you know as well as I do, an insult sometimes can cut just like a knife. Or a criticism can hurt just as much as a slap in the face. I mean criticism from the one you loved and married. A contemptible remark about your manhood or Ladiness can be as damaging as a beating. Scorn can be as painful as a wound. And so there are other types of abuse besides physical, verbal, in ways that I don't care to get into tonight. Really, they're on tape. All of those games husbands and wives play, they're not keeping the peace. They're determined to break the peace. Now, all of that's on tape in our studies. That's available to those who haven't heard them or want to re-listen. Now, that's peace in the home. Probably the hardest place to keep the peace. Let's come next to peace out there in the world. The role of the peacemaker, Jesus said, is a blessed one. And it should be carried on outside the home, out into the world, in our daily contacts with others. Whether it's that driver that is determined to wreck your car with the way he's driving. You keep the peace. You don't want to ever assert your rights. Now here again, you can make your own studies, but the facts and figures and statistics will show that a lot of people get beat up and murdered by irate drivers, and you were in the right, but you stopped long enough to let them know they were wrong. And they get out with tire irons and fracture skulls, and just heard not too long ago of a girl, somebody ran into her, young woman in Chicago, and she didn't have sense enough to stay in her car and go on. She got out and asserted her rights and ended up dead with a knife in her stomach. I mean, this happens all the time. Have you ever noticed how the demons take control as soon as people get behind the wheel? They're demons. People that are your best of neighbors are friends who would never even get cross about anything else, yet behind a car, get out of my way. This is my car and my road, and don't you dare violate or trespass my rights. And so it is sometimes a little touch and go to keep the peace when they're determined to wreck you if they can. Well, I've had them spit at me in Indianapolis. I was right in my lane going around the center there in Indianapolis where they got about 6 streets going off, and here came this big van filled with, well, we'll just say people, won't say what kind or who, and I just asked a polite question right out the window to the rider over there. I said, did I do something wrong? I knew it hadn't. I just said, did I do something wrong? I thought I was in my right lane. Before I could get that out, he spit right in the window. Praise the Lord, didn't hit me, but now the temptation, I didn't have it then, but the temptation could be to assert your rights and run him off the road. He couldn't chase you then. But anyway, keeping the peace out there in this real world. And how about the clerks in the motels? Have you ever met a polite one? I've done a lot of traveling. I think maybe once or twice I have, because for whatever reason, they were nice, but generally they take pride in their ability to insult if you dare even suggest that that wasn't the room you rented. Or I've had 7 or 8 rooms rented out from under me when they were guaranteed. They don't care. So you keep the peace. You just say, well, praise the Lord. Or the employer who may have not understood you or whatever, you feel that he's oppressed you, you don't strike to get a raise or for whatever reason. Or the government, maybe it isn't running this world or this nation. You could do it better, but you don't protest and you don't go out and petition and all of that. And we're talking about peacemakers are going to be those who are called the children of God. And noticed here one thing I missed on the fact that America is Sodom and Gomorrah, but I'll save that for another message. But here's a program on the air. This is a preacher promoting Christianity. No, he's promoting Americanism. And he fights communism instead of preaching the gospel. And if you send in a donation, he'll send you information on how to write your congressman and protest against communists. Then here's another on the radio, same station I believe. He was from over in India, and he tells about how the government there, I don't know where this was, I'm just telling you what they said on the air, the government was going to pass a bill to make it illegal to convert people from one religion to another. And so he said 75,000 Christians, we got together and marched on the Capitol in protest. Well, to make a long story short, he said it didn't do any good, so then we decided to pray. You notice which came first. They're really peacemakers. Well, go ahead and try to black my eye, and I'll beat you over the head with my staff of office or flag or whatever. And so they decide to pray when that didn't work. Here's another, Church of the Brethren. Some 600 Church of the Brethren youth participated in a protest against, here was a company that was manufacturing arms for warfare. So they got out 600 of them on the railroad track where they would ship the nuclear weapons to other places in the country. And the youth were among participants at the Church of the Brethren National Youth Conference held earlier in Colorado and attended by more than 3,000 young people. And they speak about the demonstration put on there. Well, apparently they've never read the Sermon on the Mount. I don't know what they're reading. But this is the church not keeping the peace. And so, while we're not caught up in that, you do have to watch some of these women drivers. Keep your cool. I said that because one time I was riding in a car where a woman's driving and somebody cut her off. She said, "Those man drivers." That's the first time I ever heard the expression. Well, apparently some of you have never heard about, you blame everything on women drivers. But while this is kind of obvious to some of us, I want to touch on an area where it's not so obvious. And friends, sometimes it's very difficult. I don't mean that you have to struggle every time you get in your car and you go to the store, but there's some areas where it's difficult not to want to justify yourself or defend your rights or to ignore the rights of others. And that is the area that has never been touched on, as far as I know, of minor authority figures. Minor authority figures, where we should be willing to respect their rights and their rules, like the librarian. I'm talking about minor authority figures. That's her library. When you walk in there within her 4 square walls, that's her territory. And she expects you to obey her rules. The librarian, the parking lot attendant, or the elevator operator. See, he's only got 6 square feet, but that's his domain. Parking lot belongs to that parking lot attendant. You don't just rush in there and scatter gravel all over the place. Or the custodian down at the building where you work, or the school, or even the dog catcher. Now, while we tend to keep the peace, and we don't make waves with important authority figures, like the President of the United States, or your employer for whom you work, or the policeman. You don't tend to make waves with them because you know what will happen, but anyway, you justify it, I'm a Christian, I'm not going to talk back to the policeman. But with these minor authority figures, you let them know that you weren't born yesterday, and that you've got some rights, and so on and so forth. And the tendency is sometimes to give them back what they give you. Like the motel clerk who rented your room out from under you. You could say, what more could you expect from somebody who'd work at a job like this? If you were very smart, you wouldn't be working as a motel clerk here at 3 o'clock in the morning. But you don't say those things. And I could tell you stories about them, but we won't digress too much. But the temptation is sometimes to run over them because they're trying to run over you. But keeping the peace, and this is a very important area, as I say, that as far as I know hasn't been touched on. You should respect the rights and rules of minor authority figures, whether it's the dog catcher or whatever, as much as you would major authority figures. You see, there are people who believe in nonresistance, like this church. So because you practice nonresistance, you don't want to enter into any war with Lebanon, but you think nothing about a war with the librarian if she doesn't respond the way you think she should. So I'm saying, dear friends, it's very important, if we're going to keep the peace at home, keep the peace with the bad drivers. And every one of us know that there have been temptations not to keep the peace with these minor authority figures. Let's take the librarian for an example. You've got to understand these people in order to keep peace with them. 2 things dominate her life: books and silence. Now, so many people don't realize that, and they go into a library and get all upset because they can't talk loud or smoke or have her jump, as soon as they walk in and serve them like a waitress or something. And we'll get to waitresses later because that's one of the minor authority figures that most people can't keep peace with. But the librarian, you see, You have to respect her rules. And bookworms or book wanters should never ever interrupt the librarian who is always busy. Have you ever noticed they're never sitting there waiting for customers? They're always busy, making out reports, reading a book. Do they read all of those books they put on the shelves? Apparently they do. They're always got their head in a book. And bookworms should be quiet in libraries. And so peacemakers do not rush up to her desk and in a boisterous voice, "Do you have any books on woodworking? I want to..." And she'll fix you with a gaze that would wilt fresh cabbage. Shh will be her reply. And then after she does that, she won't wait on you. She'll sit there for a moment or two going on about her work, letting you know that she will not be intimidated by bookworms or book wanters. And so peacemakers know this, and so they walk in quietly, they walk up to her desk, and they stand there. They don't say anything because she's always busy. You never interrupt her. And you most certainly never, ever, ever clear your throat to let her know you're there. She knows you're there. You disturb the quiet, still air surrounding her desk. Just the very fact that you walked in and walked up to her desk, it rattled papers and And so peacemakers will stand there, and in a moment she'll look up and raise a quizzical eyebrow, which is, "What do you want, sir?" And then in a polite, quiet voice, "I'm interested in a book or books on woodworking because I just built a garage. I got a lot of 2x4s left over and I want to make something. And I'm impressed that although this is a big library, you are aware of all the books you've got here and know just where to direct me. And so I'd like to know if you have any good books on wood." And that's about as far as you get. Her hand goes up. Nothing else has to be said. And she'll take you over and spend an hour if she needs researching and pointing out this and that and the other. Why? You've respected her minor authority rules. She's a minor authority. That's her domain. Now see if you understand librarians, you can keep the peace. That might sound a little facetious, but you could apply that to all custodians or whatever. You don't run in and track up the gym floor after he's cleaned it up, mopped it. Or say the principal said we could play ball. Where are the keys? He'll let you know it doesn't matter what the principal said. He is the custodian. He has the keys. And you do it his way. You walk in, and if nothing else, you say, "Please, Mr. Barnswiger." And so on. And then, let's take the parking lot attendant. I'm just giving you some examples, friends. It may sound a little humorous, but the point is, we violate their rules and their domain. You never come grinding at about 30 miles an hour in this parking lot, throwing dust and gravel, and jump out of your car, pitch the keys. "I'll be back in a minute, buddy. Park my wheels." Now you see, you've disturbed his peace, you've entered his domain, you've trespassed, you've violated a lot of his rules. His rules are, nobody drives fast in my lot. Nobody comes and tells me what they're going to do. They wait for me to come out of my little shack and get out a ticket and go through the ritual of tearing it in two and all of that. And thirdly, and this is a big rule, nobody calls me Mac or Buddy. So peacemakers in parking lots, you drive in slowly. You park your car in front of his little shack. You get out, not he. You go over to the window and you wait until he recognizes you. He's always counting money or stacking tickets or throwing away stubs. And then he will come out. He won't come out till you go to the window. He will come out after he finds out you want to park a car. I don't know what else you'd be doing there, but you're supposed to tell him. And he will take out his little ticket and he will mark the time on it and he will tear that in half ever so nicely. He'll put one under the windshield and then hand you the other, the stub. And it's a good practice, say thank you. And then give him an idea approximately when you're going to be back so he'll know how to park your car. If you're going to be gone all day, he'll put it up against the wall and 3 others in front of it, so you're not getting out. It doesn't hurt to wave as you leave. Peacemakers. You see, people don't practice peacemaking in all of these areas where we're dealing with minor authority figures. Because everybody who has a job is a minor authority figure, whether he's sweeping the street or whatever. You don't throw things down in the gutter after he just swept that spot. He'll fix you with a stare that calls you to pick it up. Let's take the waitress. We're talking about keeping the peace out there with minor authority figures. Now, you'll never, ever be able to keep peace when you go out to eat unless you understand why waitresses are waitresses. You have to understand from the outset, most waitresses don't like to be waitresses. They're only doing it because they need the money, husband has insufficient income, or they want to buy a better used car. And it is not evidence that she dislikes you personally because she has that frown on her face. It's just that she dislikes people who come into restaurants to eat because she doesn't want to be a waitress. And the fact you're there, you're keeping her from doing other things she'd rather do. She has to work, but still, it's a built-in dislike for customers because that's why she has to be a waitress, because you're wanting to eat. Now, she's got rules that you've got to follow. And we've eaten out a lot, and we've learned a lot of these rules by experience. Her first rule, this is first. You may think some others are more important, but this is first. Never, ever take children out to eat in a restaurant. That's her first rule. But since she knows, she's realistic, that you will anyway, then feed them before you come. And all she'll have to do is bring them a chicken leg or something and gnaw on the bone. And then if you're going to bring children, feed them, and then never let them get noisy. Keep them quiet, and don't let them mess. Now, you'll understand why waitresses say that if you ever look under a table after even one, but take 2 or 3 children, have come and gone. Oh, you don't want to sit there. You want to go to some other table if there have been children, because people who, practice decorum and manners and all at home and have the children ever so nice, when they go out to eat, it's just a time to see who can throw the mashed potatoes the farthest. And everything that served to them is thrown on the floor, it looks like, instead of them eating any of it. So the first rule, keep children out of my restaurant, but she's realistic. Secondly, people, these are her rules. This is why that you have no peace in restaurants. People should have their minds made up when I get back 30 or 40 minutes later after giving them the menu. They should know what they want. You ever eaten out, it's usually 30 or 40 minutes later, and you should have your mind made up. Why should she stand there while you go around again? Well, what are you having? So if you practice these things, you're going to keep peace in restaurants. Never change your order in the middle of the stream. You notice waitresses never carry pencils with erasers, they have pens. You change your order, they have to scratch that out, and that upsets the cook, and she's upset. So never change your order. Make your mind up. You've got 30 or 40 minutes to do it. You ought to know what you want. And then, people should never ask for special treatment. Like, can I have the peas instead of the carrots? Which always gets a reply, no. No substitutes. See the sign. That's the same with, if you get in there at 10:31 and they stop serving breakfast at 10:30. Oh, they love that one. Sorry, sir. We're serving lunch now. And so I figured out a way to get around those. You see, I eat like bacon and eggs for breakfast and coffee and orange juice. So you get around it by saying, would you bring me a bacon and egg sandwich, a cup of coffee, and a glass of orange juice? And they'll jump at that right. Oh, sure, sir. We've got that right on the menu. And then you just take it off your plate, put your egg there, and you bake it over. But if you want to keep the peace, you don't let her know you're doing that. Oh boy, you want to keep the peace. So no substitutes, no breakfast after 10:30. You have to learn the rules, friends. You go through life upset and upsetting others simply because you don't follow the rules of these minor authority figures. You see, everybody eats out a whole lot or somewhat. if you can stand it, which is another subject we won't digress on. And then never do what I always do, my wife does. I don't know anybody else that does this, but you never order 2 drinks at the same time with a meal. She's sure to forget them both. You know, we order coffee and maybe a soft drink because we don't eat out that much, and so the soft drink is to refresh me and quench my thirst. The coffee is because I drink coffee with my meals. But you never order them together. If you do, she'll forget them both. Invariably forget them both. So we've learned the secret of ordering the meal and say, will you please bring the coffee with the meal? If you don't, you'll get it first. You ever notice these people filling up the coffee cup? 10 cups. I don't know where they've got room for the meal just because it's free. So living the abundant life, I don't want free coffee. I just want coffee with the meal. So my wife and I have trained ourselves after they bring the meal, bring the coffee, and then she's all done. Is everything all right? We say, do you sell soft drinks too? Oh, yes, we do. Well, would you bring us 2, whatever? And that doesn't confuse them. I'm telling you, friends, it is utter chaos and confusion if you order 2 drinks at once. You know, we have a fun thing out of this because it just happens everywhere you go. It's like when I ordered beans in the cafeteria, soup beans, I'll say I want mostly soup. You know, when they're putting it in, I want mostly soup, and every time, without exception, they'll pour the soup out and give me more beans. Because everybody's wanting freebies as much as they can get for nothing. I live the abundant life, so I want the soup. But they think, you know, that you don't want the water, you want the beans. Another thing we've learned not to do is order the dessert while she's taking orders for the main course. You have to learn her rules and her ways. Because if you order dessert while she's taking the main course, she'll, sorry sir, I'll be back and take that later. We take the dessert orders later. And then she never does because she comes back with a check all totaled up. She doesn't want to serve you dessert because that takes 30 minutes longer. And she could be seating other customers and getting a second tip. She's not going to get any more tip out of you because you got a piece of pie. So they're glad enough to forget it. And so you have to learn how to catch them, though, so you can get your dessert, because they'll bring the check totaled if they can. Now, if you don't follow her rules, and another one is don't dawdle over your coffee for an hour after I've served you, my feet hurt. I want to clean your table, seat others, or go home. If you don't follow her rules, she's got 100 ways of fouling up your order. That well-done steak comes to you, not dead yet, still bleeding and jumping all over the plate. French fries come cold and hard. And the drink comes with so much ice in the glass that you've paid $1 for, that Pepsi or whatever it is, that after 2 sips in the straw, the glass is empty. She's got 100 ways to foul you up if you don't follow her rules. Or she'll do, as so many do, bring the drinks first so the ice can water down the drinks. If you're going to save it for your meal, you've either got to drink it right away so it has some taste and not taste like watered down tea, if it's a Pepsi. Or if you save it, then the drink does taste like watered down tea. So learn what waitresses require of people who are disturbing their peace even by coming in the door. Another category, and I'll get off this onto that third aspect, is people don't understand bus drivers and elevator operators, I've found. Not too well. And both of them have one rule in common. As soon as you step on their bus or in their elevator, move to the rear. So peacemakers have learned never to say, but I get off at the next stop or the next floor. You violated his rules, you ruffled him. In other words, I'm not going to move. I'll just stand here right by the door so when it opens I can get off the next floor, whatever it is. You don't do that because he'll go by your stop at least 2 or 3 blocks to let you off and then catch your ankle in the door if he can as you get off. Or he'll go on past your floor, go all the way to the top of that 40-story building and come back down, then stop the elevator about 5 inches below or above the level of the lobby or the floor so that after you sprawl out there, you didn't see it. He says, watch your step, please. And so, peacemakers, this is true about bus drivers and elevator operators. I've had personal experience. So peacemakers, when they get on the elevator, they immediately rush to the back of the elevator, do 180 degrees, and then soft shoe over to the corner, take in a breath, and get as thin as they can while he loads onto his elevator at least 10 more people than it was ever designed to carry. And then, as you feel the vibration of the elevator beginning to move, you say in a soft, polite tone, 5th floor, please. Now, he hears all of that, and he's punching buttons. 5th floor, please. And then he knows that anyone that have any sense enough to come to town to begin with, to get on his elevator, they don't wait until they get to the 5th floor. But as people are getting off and on, you are soft-shoeing your way around to get up near the front so that it doesn't have to let half the people off to let you off. And then let them back on. It doesn't hurt to say thank you when you get off. And then another rule of elevator operators, we'll limit this to elevator operators since that's the way we started, you never carry a lot of packages on his elevator. Remember that 6 by 6 by 6 is his domain. Especially with these little hand carts that you see women sometimes going to the supermarket with. I remember not too long ago that I bought quite a bit of equipment in a certain building. And we brought it down on the elevator, and I took it home, and it just wasn't what I wanted, so I was going to take it back. I've got a little small hand cart. It was bulky and heavy. So instead of making 5 trips from the trunk up there, I put it all on the little hand cart. I pushed it up to the elevator door. Door swung open, and he took one look at that. One look at me. You don't get on my elevator with all of that. I said, I came down your elevator with all that when I bought it. You know, something about when you buy it, it must be different than when you take it back. I said, I got on your elevator with all this. Now, I didn't say that sarcastically. I was just giving the facts of life. It's okay to talk occasionally to keep the peace. He said, not on my elevator you didn't. I said, on your elevator. He said, it must have been my day off. Because nobody gets on my elevator with a handcart. Has to be packages in the arms. My boss wouldn't like that. He doesn't want anyone on the elevator with something that might hit somebody in the ankle. He didn't say that, but I figured that out. So I didn't debate. He said, take the freight elevator and walk. So we got it up the freight elevator. We kept the peace. Now, just recently I went back to the same building, and I carried stuff on his elevator. I'll tell you, I had a movie projector screen that was at least 7 feet tall. I think was almost higher than his elevator. Big thing, and a big tripod, and a big aluminum case. I won't say what kind, but a big, heavy case, and an armload of stuff in a brown paper bag, and had to have a clerk help me to carry all that. We had it in our arms, you see. He didn't say you can't get on my elevator. He smiled. He spoke. He was happy. His boss was happy. I was happy. We kept the peace. Well, friends, we could go on all night, but lest we tarry about minor authority figures, I trust you have the point. That keeping the peace is not just talking about it. It's keeping it in the home. It's keeping it out there. You will with the policeman. Will you with that parking lot attendant? That's his lot. Don't mess up his rules. And the waitress, I've already told you now how to have a happy meal in a restaurant. That's keeping the peace. What is it to look daggers back at the waitress who's looking daggers at you and wishing you'd leave and you don't enjoy your meal just because you broke some of her rules? Remember, she doesn't like to be a waitress to begin with. I don't know about bus drivers. They should like it in Chicago. We just heard where they make over $30,000 up to $50,000 a year to drive a bus. Boy, they've got a union. Well, anyway, so I guess they're happy. And so the third area is God and our getting our priorities in the right order. God versus possessions or materialism. Matthew 6:19-34. 6:33, seek you first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. Don't take any thought for your material needs, and God says, I will supply them. I'm not going to spend a lot of time in this area because we've got much teaching and tape and literature on it. If we are going to build our house on stone and not sand, then we're not going to be seeking, as the whole world, including the professing church, does, seeking the byproducts of the kingdom. But we'll be seeking the kingdom itself. We will not be possessed by our possessions. You know what the great American obsession is? acquiring things that will give them a measure of security, they think, or happiness, whether it's a pair of water skis or a new Jaguar. Did you know, are you aware that you live in a nation that spends $500 million a year? Let me repeat it. $500 million a year for bubble gum? Newsweek magazine. I didn't know that either, but I'm not surprised. Have to watch where you walk, don't you? Oh, you really do. I don't know how many times, whether it's in a motel or whatever, you get this odor, it's bubble gum. Then I've actually had to clean my shoes more than once. But anyway, $500 million a year. People are starving in parts of the world. But that isn't the worst. $3 billion a year. And if you want to know how much $1 billion is, you can just take them in dollar bills and see how far they'll stretch out in space. It'll surprise you how much $1 billion is. Most people have no conception of $1 billion. Sometimes just try to figure out how long it would take you to count $1 billion one at a time, and you'll see how much $1 billion is. $3 billion a year is spent on dogs and doggy items, such as contact lenses for dogs' eyes, doggy pajamas so they can rest at night, jewel-studded collars that cost thousands of dollars, real diamonds and rubies, fur-trimmed snowsuits, little shoes to keep their little toesies warm in the snow, doggy birthday cakes, birthday cards, and hold on to your seatbelts, birth control pills for dogs. 3 billion. Millions of people starving throughout parts of the world, and America is caught up in spending $500 million for bubble gum, $3 billion on their dogs. Trying to acquire possessions because they think that's going to give them a measure of happiness or security, like houses and lands and boats and cars and whatever. Well, remember Matthew 6:19-34. Take no thought. And we've got 3 passages that say, be content with such as you have. Hebrews 13:5, Philippians 4:11, 1 Timothy 6:8. Be content. Now, to be content with what you have as you read the whole Bible, and that includes the New Testament, does not mean be content with being poor and owing everyone in town. But have a contented attitude that whatever trial or delay and manifestation of something financial, whatever you may experience, you're content where you're at because you know God's not going to let you starve. Back in the college days, I literally did not have a nickel for a pack of gum. Literally. But we had 3 meals a day, got all of our debts paid, and never went hungry. We were content. So being content doesn't mean what institutional religion means when they're talking about their missionaries or how the charismatics emphasize prosperity. They don't practice what they preach in the area of finances any more than they do in the matter of sickness and healing. They don't practice what they preach. They say it's divine sickness and then immediately try to get rid of God's will by getting rid of all the sickness. And so it is with possessions or finances. They don't practice that poverty business themselves. Tell me somebody in any institutional church, or anywhere else for that matter, that isn't spending all of his or her time seeking the byproducts of the kingdom. The material things that Jesus said, if you take no thought, I will provide them. And so, if you have no affection, there are 2 sides to this matter of getting your priorities straight, seeking first the kingdom of God and His righteousness. He'll provide you material things. There are 2 sides. There is the abundant life promise. Read it in Mark chapter 10, for example. Forsake it all, He says, I'll give it back 100-fold. And so if you have no affection for these things, as we've taught you, set your affection on things above and not on the possessions down here, the earth beneath, then He can trust you with the abundance. And certainly He's blessed us that way as we've learned what faith is. Because When the Lord saved me and called me in to prepare for the ministry, I couldn't sell my business. I was in business, so I just closed it up. Happy to do it. And we had literally all of our possessions in the back seat and trunk of our car. And at that time had 2 children and put them up on top of the possessions in the back seat. I'd gone from new cars to an old 1940 Plymouth. And that was in 52, so it's already 12 years old. So we left with all of our possessions in that little old car, and by walking by faith, by the time we left college, it took a moving truck, took a truck to haul the furniture away, and we never bought one stick of it. God had provided. In fact, we had to leave furniture. Had no place to put it on the truck. And I wasn't about to make another trip back to get it. And because it's total faith in the ministry, we've not tried to merchandise the gospel, and you know that by now, I'm sure. Then God provides abundantly. He does. I have no lack and no want. And we're able to help others when we see their needs. Well, in these 3 areas of purity, peace, and prosperity, as you examine these 3 areas, it will help you to determine, after you've put your hand to the plow, after you've visited the upper room, whether you're building your life upon stone or upon sand. If you're not striving after purity and peace with all men, and he says both of those are required to see God, purity and peace. And if you're not getting your priorities straight and seeking first the kingdom and God's righteousness, well, you're building on sand, not upon the rock. There's no point in singing about I'm standing on the rock if you're really not standing on the rock. And the only way you know you're on the rock is when these 3 things are evidenced in your life, that you have a pure heart. You have a love toward everyone to where you would not in any way hurt or demand your rights, try to get your way just because you're who you are. You're a peacemaker. In the marriage too, friends, blessed are the peacemakers. Don't wait for her to make the peace. You make it. Or vice versa. And then the matter of possessions is where so many fail, so many fall. They just don't have the faith to trust the God they say they worship. And so they get their priorities all mixed up, and God gets second best, if that. Sometimes it's third or fifth. Father, in Jesus' name, let the word find place in every heart to the end that they and we all will fulfill the purpose for which we have been introduced to the plow in the upper room, saved and baptized in the Spirit, that our lives will show that the purpose is being fulfilled. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.